Thank you everyone very much for coming to this event. So this is one of a series of events that are being run through the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence, which is looking at all of the possible implications of the AI revolution for science, for politics, for society. We've been running a series of events, the strand that I'm responsible for, my name is David Runciman, I should have said up front, which is looking at some of these implications for politics in particular. And we're interested in how AI, the coming of the robots, relates to some things that we're more familiar with, because these aren't the first artificial creatures that we have built that are capable of doing all sorts of things, including speaking. And so we've also been looking at how artificially intelligent machines relate to the kinds of responsibilities and fears that we have in relation to corporations and other kinds of artificial actors. And the theme of tonight's session is to look at the full range of those kinds of non-human actors in relation to the question of free speech. So the title is Free Speech and Non-Human Speakers. And I'm delighted we've got three very distinguished human speakers to talk about this from lots of different angles. Professor Philip Pettit, who's the Rockefeller Professor of Politics and Human Values at Princeton, Professor Toni Erskine, Professor of International Relations at the University of New South Wales, Professor Rae Langton, who is Knightsbridge Professor of Philosophy here in Cambridge. They're each going to speak for around 8 minutes, just to set up 8 to 10 minutes. I'm going to be very strict as well. To set up some of the broad philosophical, practical, political themes of this topic. I may then ask one or two questions, and then we're going to leave lots of time for discussion and questions from the floor as well. And I think Philip is going to go first.
Thank you very much, David. It's a real pleasure to be here. I was a research fellow here back in the 1970s, the very beginning, I suppose, my career, and I'm very grateful to this college. They picked up an Irishman of very erratic taste and eccentric training, and gave me a research fellowship, which was a wonderful experience, and I feel terribly grateful to the college. But all of that said, onto the theme. Okay, so with speech, I think, and this is going to connect with some themes we covered in this conference today, or last night everybody was there. The first thing I think to say about speech is that it would be a bad mistake, and I'm sure probably many people agree with that, to think of speech as just coming after mind and after personhood, to think of speech as just a means whereby a mind communicates its contents to other minds, a person communicates his or her beliefs, attitudes, values, desires to others. I think rather that speech comes in very, very early. Now, undoubtedly, non-human animals have got minds, they're rational in various ways, and no doubt our progenitors were just like that. But when speech came on the scene, I think there's every reason to think that massive changes, incalculable changes occurred. I actually think we know that there's a very small bit of genetic difference between us and the higher primates, but there is a massive difference in the impact we've made on the world, and I think that goes down to speech. Now, I'm not going to talk about speech and its relationship to other aspects of mentality, but let me just draw attention to one connection with personhood, because that then in turn connects to legal persons or corporate persons, which is a sort of non-human voice. So the figure I'd like to start with is Thomas Hobbes, who in chapter 16 of Leviathan, a book he published in 1651, really, I think, opened up a wholly novel way of thinking, but did it very briefly, and it doesn't get enough attention, I think, in contemporary thought. And what he pointed out was this. When somebody speaks, when I say, I tell you what I believe, I tell you that I'm of a certain religion, I tell you I believe that Trump is a disaster in the United States, or whatever I might say, or when I tell you that I'm going to be at the concert tonight, I'll see you there, I'll be at the match tomorrow morning. First thing he really points out is that's not just a report on my state of mind. I might report to David. So I might say, I understand David is, really committed to such and such a cause. I understand he'll be at dinner this evening. I speak about him, it's true, but I don't speak for him. And that shows up in the fact that if he isn't there, and you complain to me, you told me he'd be there and he wasn't, I'd say, gosh, I must have gotten David wrong. I must have misheard, I must have misread, or whatever. But if I say I'll be there, where let's say that's what we call a pledge or a promise, and I don't turn up, I can't say, God, I must have gotten myself wrong, you know. I must have been mistaken about my own mind. I was sure I was going to be there, but, you know, I misreported. I can't excuse myself like that, can I? Because I wasn't speaking about myself. I can't even say, oh, gosh, I changed my mind since then. No, you'll say, you promised, for God's sake, right? Now, that idea of avowing a belief or a desire where you can't make the excuse, I got myself wrong, or pledging an action or an intention where you can't make the excuse, I got myself wrong, or even the excuse, I changed my mind, those are words that speak for me. They don't just speak about me. And you can hold me to those words. And in these words where I avow my attitudes or I pledge my actions, in these words when I speak for myself, I commit myself in the following perfectly ordinary sense, that I'm really laying out a bet with you that you can have a go at me, you know, and I'll have no excuse if I don't live up to these words. In particular, I won't have the excuse that I got myself wrong or I changed my mind. I've ruled out those excuses. I'm betting on not having to rely on them, so to speak, and I'm inviting you to rely on me. I mean, that we're projecting a persona, just now on this very narrow front of what I'm going to do, where I'm going to be, but in life, as speakers, we constantly speak for ourselves to others. As Hobbes puts it, our words, we utter them in such a way that they are considered our own. We own these words, and we own the mind for which they speak. We put ourselves out there, so to speak. That's who I am. That's what I'm going to do. That's what I believe. That's what I value. And in general, throughout life, with other people, we speak for ourselves. We create, let's call it a persona, to put it very briefly. Now, Hobbes argued, I think very plausibly, what's the difference between an ordinary agent? After all, a dog is an agent. All sorts of robots are agents. I would say they've got goals. They pursue the goals according to representations of the environment, the perfectly sensible sorts of systems that operate for purposes in that way. What's the difference between such an agent and a person is that a person is an agent who can speak for themselves in the sense of committing themselves, creating a persona, holding out an image to others of who they are, and of course holding out that image to themselves, so that you, by virtue of my words, as Hobbes will put it, you own me, you have a hold on me, you know, and you can reject me if I fail to live up to the self that I've said I am. Now, all of that, the capacity to give your word is associated with the capacity to be a person. And to be a person is just to be an agent who can give your word and be held to the word. You also have to be capable, of course, of living up to your word, because others will give up on you very fast if you don't live up to your word. So that's what it is to be a person. That's the first thing I want to say. Now, of course, we regard children as persons. We regard those who are demented, you know, as persons still. But that's mainly, they're of a kind with us. They're going to be fully fledged persons who can give their word to others and be held to that word. Or they're of a kind with us, like they're suffering, sadly, say, from dementia in old age. But the core notion of a person is this notion of a committal agent, an agent who commits themselves to others. Now notice, and Hobbes makes this point too, he thinks you couldn't become a person on your own. I mean, imagine the Robinson Crusoe world, you're the only person around. Because, well, you could give your word to yourself, you might say. I could promise myself to do such and such, but as Hobbes says, and David can quote it, I'm sure, verbatim as well, he that binds can loose. You can always let yourself off the hook. But living with other people, dependent on them, and of course where your reputation with them is vital for succeeding, and that was true of all of us currently and all of our predecessors, it was really important that you could create a persona that others could rely on and that you could live up to. In particular, you could live up to it even when it was very difficult. So, for example, you know, immediately, you know, well, it's desirable to do this because I've given my word, or I'm assumed to have given my word, as you will be assumed to have done when it's a standard accepted on all sides, and you didn't disavow it. You'll be expected to not steal, not be violent, not lie, and so on. And here you are doing that. You're implicitly not living up to the persona you were projecting, perhaps explicitly, as in actually giving your word, perhaps implicitly as being manifestly assumed to be committed in that way to that word. And you can't become a person except among persons. And that's what makes us persons, that we are reciprocally, mutually dependent for becoming people, agents who can project a persona, an image of themselves, be held to it, and fairly reliably live up to it. Now, I think that's, myself, a very important background for thinking about robotic agents and artificial intelligence, and could they ever be persons? And my own sense is they would have to be created as a society, because I think the individual becomes a person in virtue of the social relations with others who count as persons too, because people commit to themselves, they hold out an image of themselves, they live up to it, they hold one another to that image. That's what it is to be a person. I'll just wind up by saying, because I'm just got 1 minute left, I think, that the interesting thing is that corporate bodies can actually count as persons, because a group of individuals, maybe it could be just the four of us here, perhaps we unite for a certain purpose of, advancing maybe an environmental purpose, and we realize in order to be a group, we've got to form common judgments about what the best opportunities and means are for pursuing that purpose, and we are going to have to find someone to speak for us. Maybe David will speak for us, and we just rally behind his voice. Or maybe we go by some sort of voting procedure. There are complexities there I won't address now. To create the voice we'll rally behind. And the point is that voice will be our voice as a group agent. It will speak for us, and it won't speak about us. It's not, if David is the spokesperson, he's not going to say, well, I think we as a group. No, he's going to say, we're for this, right, if we've appointed a spokesperson, and we're committed to live up to it. That means as a group that we can be spoken for, we hold out a persona as a group, we make contracts, we make promises, we invite the reliance of other such groups, our individual agents, and we claim the ability to be able to live up to those words, and if we don't, we fail. Now, that's why we call corporate bodies legal persons. I think they're perfectly appropriately called legal persons. I'm all for that. That is not to say that they have the same rights or should have the same rights as natural persons, persons like you and me, and no doubt that'll be a topic in the discussion, and I'd love to have a bite on that if it is a topic that we all share in, but I've got to stop at that point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll do the applause at the end.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. My concern is that the future of machine intelligence is going to spell a future of human unintelligence. And my particular concern is the role of machine speech in the democratic speech situation. Now, this is a topic I haven't thought much about before. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to think about it. And this morning at the conference, David began with a half jest, I think, saying that Facebook knows better than you do how you'll vote, so don't bother voting, or something like that. Well, you were imagining it. It was a half jest. So we were thinking about the kind of entity, something like Facebook or Twitter or many other sorts of strange things that are with one face corporations, with another face they're the network of people who use it, and with another face, yet again, they are themselves a kind of machine intelligence. So I wondered to myself, what would happen if this machine intelligence, Facebook's actually not the best example, but suddenly went like HAL in 2001, A Space Odyssey. So what would happen? So you'll remember the scene in 2001 where Dave, coincidentally, Dave, wanted something, and Hal says, I'm sorry, Dave, I'm afraid you can't do that. So just imagine, we have actually a situation right now where the machine intelligences that exist, so I'm not talking about future super-duper machines that really we should respect as speakers, but the ones that actually exist, these speakers are undermining the speech situation by resisting what we want in the way that Hal does. So suppose when you want to talk to someone, you want to talk to a speaker who is at least aiming at the truth. So they're aiming, even if they don't get it right, they're at least sincere, they're aiming at the truth. So you'd like to speak with a speaker who's trying to say something true, and the machine intelligence out there is going to tell you, I'm sorry, Dave, I'm afraid I can't do that. We can't do that because, as some of you know, in the electoral speech coming up to the US election, it was about 20% on Twitter. 20% of the speech on Twitter was generated by bots. I think most people are aware of that. This has happened in different areas in the UK as well, with respect to the referendum and with respect to the recent election too. So you want a truth-tracking speaker to talk with, and no, we can't have that. We want a human speaker if we can, but of course we're going to be told, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that either. It's very hard to tell the robot speakers from the others. We're faced with replicant speakers around us, and apparently the main way you can tell is that they speak a whole lot more, like on Twitter, thousands and thousands of posts a day, and that's the main way to spot a robot. The other way to detect them, I found out, is by their punctuation habits. They're much more consistent, apparently. Whereas human speakers are either all exclamations and smileys or much more similar. Anyway, so you want a truth-tracking speech, you want human speech, you want diverse speech. Now, everyone knows that we are living in echo chambers all the time. People have written whole books about this topic. And the echo chambers are partly a result of what we want, what we desire, and machines feeding us what we desire, where what they're feeding us is not, the latest... what they're feeding us is speech. So speech is a good that's being fed to us in accordance with our desires. But of course, that's got nothing to do with whether they're true. It's whether we like it. So we have self-imposed censorship. So when I want a diverse speaker to talk, if I want a diverse marketplace of ideas, Hal out there is going to say, sorry, I can't do that either. So human speakers, truth-tracking speakers, diverse speakers, we haven't got those. This is the reality we are already facing. Why does this matter? How am I going?
3 4 more.
Okay. Why does this matter? Because we have to step back and think, what is the point of free speech in the first place? What is the point of speech? I mentioned truth tracking, I meant human speech, I mentioned diverse speakers. These themes are all there in Mill. Mill took for granted that free speech is part of human flourishing. He obviously did not have other sorts of speakers in mind at that point, but he did definitely have a vision of human flourishing and the idea that when speaking freely is part of the package of human flourishing. He also thought that the main point of free speech, if you had to nail it down, was, as he put it, truth. So that didn't mean that you can only utter things when they're true. It meant that the point of free speech, the point of letting people express their opinions freely without censorship from the government, is that even the false opinions can actually lead us to the truth. If we squash an opinion beforehand, for all we know, it might be true, so we shouldn't squash it ahead of time. Even if it's false, we should let it be part of the marketplace of ideas, so-called, because it'll test the commitments that we already have, because it helps us reach knowledge when we get to talk with people who disagree with us. I won't give you Mill's whole argument from truth, but the role of speech in human flourishing is one thing, and the role of speech in a democracy is the other. This theme of knowledge was built on then by the theorist Michael John, who said that the point of free speech is actually to get the kind of knowledge we need so that democracy works. This is the idea that the media is there to help keep the bastards honest, as we say in Australia, that the media is there to supply knowledge to all of us in a democracy, because without knowledge, you can't even vote. Without knowledge, it's not your choice. We know this when it comes to medical decisions. If your doctor's lying to you, it's not your choice. Now, if the media is lying to you, that's human speakers, that's one thing. If robots are lying to you because they have got no truth trackers at all, they've just got viral self-replicators, then that is getting in the way of knowledge as well. And I just want to say it's getting in the way of knowledge not just because it's feeding us misinformation, but because it's breaking down the trust on which on which democratic communication depends. So robots do not have rights to free speech. I haven't argued that, but I'm going to stick to that. So if we can't get other robots to shut them up, and there are bots out there trying to shut up hate speech, by the way, so I think that's quite an interesting development. But if we can't get that to happen, we've got to find some other way to make them shut up. Thank you.
Thank you. So starting with free speech, according to Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which contains the first statement of the right to freedom of expression, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1966, was meant to elaborate on this and contains a more detailed but very similar statement about freedom of expression. Everyone shall have the right to hold opinions without interference. Everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression, and this right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art, or through any other media of choice. But who is everyone? And we were asked to speak about non-human speakers. And I think there are three potential categories of non-human speakers: corporate entities, which have been addressed, conceivably, I think, some non-human animals. And I immediately thought of the example of the gorilla Coco, who has learned more than 1,000 words of modified American Sign Language. And the third category is robots, computers, intelligent machines, forms of artificial intelligence. And I want to focus on the third potential category in my comments: forms of artificial intelligence. And this is an area where rapid technological change is having far-reaching practical consequences and raising incredibly difficult ethical questions, and these deserve attention. Now, I haven't considered robots and free speech before. One of my research interests is artificial intelligence in the form of military robots and the practical and ethical problems posed by their increasing autonomy, combined with their capacity to kill us. Now, the increasing capacities and autonomy of forms of robots that can kill us is a cause for concern, expressed through, for example, the movement to ban killer robots. By comparison, intelligent machines being considered to have a right to free speech seems fairly innocuous. Yet I find this worrying. In considering forms of artificial intelligence and free speech, I want to raise three questions for consideration. The first question is simply, are computers, intelligent machines, and robots actually capable of the type of speech that is deemed to warrant protection? So Siri speaks to us from our iPhones and answers questions, and even, I have learned, can tell jokes if we ask her to. Our GPS devices talk to us. Military robots relay information to the human soldiers who work alongside them. Facebook has a translation function. These serve a purpose. They're useful tools. They may be the media through which speakers can express themselves, but how can they be understood to be speaking themselves? I want to turn to a particular case. In 2003, a civil suit was brought against Google by a company that was unhappy with the ranking of Google's search results. Now, Google's response was that its search results are constitutionally protected free speech. And Google won the court case. In 2012, in the face of further scrutiny, Google commissioned a law professor to draft a detailed version of the same argument that Google's search results are constitutionally protected free speech. The resulting paper asserts that Google, Bing, and Yahoo and other search engines are speakers. And the logic of the argument is that the choices they make constitute speech. So to provide an example, if I type into Google, do robots have the right to free speech? Then Google will provide a list in a particular order, a list of links in a particular order. And the argument is that these choices are speech that should be protected. And the attempt to regulate Google could thereby be considered censorship. But I'm very skeptical. Surely this ordering based on algorithms is different than machines having ideas that they can express. Tim Wu, a law professor at Columbia, who's been a vocal opponent of the idea that computers have the right to free speech, argues that protected speech must be the product of what he describes as intelligent, expressive choices. In an article titled Machine Speech, he goes on to argue that intelligent choices warrant protection only when they take the form of a speech product that is a vessel of the ideas of the speakers or whose content has been consciously curated, rather than communication tools that primarily facilitate the communication of another person or perform some task for the user. I don't think that speech as consciously curated ideas is a standard that we have yet reached in terms of forms of artificial intelligence. It may be possible in the future, but I don't think it's something that we have now. The second question is, can forms of artificial intelligence be rights holders? Those individual human beings who create and program intelligent machines do have a right to free speech. But in cases where these forms of artificial intelligence are making choices themselves, we're not talking about these individual human beings using computers as a medium to impart their own ideas. I've argued that forms of artificial intelligence cannot be moral patients in the workshop that we just had. With specific reference to forms of artificial intelligence, Mary Midgley has argued, and I quote, "Computers do not trouble our sleep with any moral claims and would not do so however intelligent they became, unless they eventually seem to be conscious, sensitive, and endowed with emotions." So I think that saying that intelligent machines could have rights is a problematic move. And the final question I want to raise is, what are the practical implications of seeing the speech of intelligent machines protected? One consequence is that claims of artificially intelligent entities having protected speech acts as an obstacle to potentially important regulation. If search choices are speech, then Google and other search engines may acquire protection from regulatory scrutiny. Claims that Google is engaged in unfair practices vis-a-vis competitors or is engaging in advertising under the guise of providing unbiased search results may be prevented from leading to a proper investigation and perhaps necessary regulation in the form of antitrust and consumer protection. And perhaps more importantly, I want to ask, is there a risk that advocating that the speech of robots and computers and intelligent machines be protected, making a mockery of the idea of free speech? Thank you.
Great, thank you all very much. So I'm going to ask one question just to kick it off, and then we'll open it up, that I think touches on what you all talked about, but going back to Philip's idea of people owning their words. Because one of the reasons why it's sometimes hard to tell the bots apart from the people online is not just because the bots are imitating us, but we're imitating them.
Yeah.
I mean, intelligent, expressive speech is not always what you encounter from the humans, never mind from the robots. And anyone who writes journalism and makes the mistake of reading the comments below the line would welcome some robots to spare us from the humans. But that connects to the question about how language and speech socializes us and what it is to own, to make commitments, to make promises, because I think along with the way in which the machines are corroding our democracy, is also that they're providing a platform in which human speech, never mind non-human speech, is breaking free from these ideas of ownership and responsibility. As it were, it's liberating, but what it's liberated us from is what Hobbes thought held society together, which is you are the owner of your words. And not just because of anonymity, because of the proliferation, the sheer volume of it, the speed of it. So in a sense, my question is, what's this environment doing to the human speakers?
You better call us by
okay.
number, name.
Whoever wants to go in first.
I'd like to say
Right,
something.
yeah.
Okay. The word normalize apparently hasn't yet made it into the dictionary in its new meaning of making something seem normal when it wasn't before. I think that my biggest concern is that bot speakers normalize attitudes by the sheer volume that you were describing. So, for instance, some of you might have heard the story about a chatbot that was trained in 2 tweets to become an anti-Semitic racist, and it just took a troll said the Jews probably did 9/11. I don't really know, but it seems likely. And then the bot, just within a few minutes, was calling for a race war and basically just searching the web for stuff that would be in keeping with this and getting wilder and wilder until after 24 hours they shut it down. So the more stuff that's out there with this kind of message, the more certain sort of hate speech, just to take that example, is getting normalized. So it feeds not just into the speech situation, but into the sense of social norms about how to treat other people.
Brilliant.
Well, I think that it's important to distinguish between a number of things. One is, the petrol gauge in your car, it tells you about the petrol in your car, but it doesn't speak to you. You know, the computer, when the sign shows the power is running down, it communicates information to you. It's very important, but it doesn't speak to you. So it's worth asking, what is it that involves speaking? Now, if you got like the example that Rae gave of the 20% of speech in the Trump election, coming from these bots or whatever, presumably that sort of speech, or let's assume, I'm not sure, was presumably put there by human beings. It's really just an amplification of the human beings who are speaking. It's just the medium whereby it goes. That's one possibility. I'm assuming it was actually like that in many cases. Another possibility is the one that Rae has just mentioned, that you've got this device that is fitted to respond to various stimuli, building, say, to a crescendo of anti-Semitism or whatever. That is not a speaker at all, I would say. It's a simulator of speech. It's been created by a human being. It's not even speaking. It's not even a channel of what the human being is saying, but it's been created by human beings in order to generate these random sort of noises that sound like speech, but they're really not actually speech. Now, when you talk about free speech, it's very interesting. Citizens United interpreted free speech in America as the First Amendment, that is to say, as requiring that, or at least arguing for, a proliferation of speech. People have compared it to sort of a waterfall of speech. The more that's out there, the better, the more speech. And I think that's quite silly. Speech is only worthwhile when it's speaking for someone who can be held to the words, who can be challenged and so on. It's part, naturally, of an interactive reciprocal relationship between people, or, it can be like this. I'm speaking to a lot of people. At the moment, you can speak back. That's part of what it's about. The sort of speech that is generated by that sort of, anti-Semitic device, for example, is really not speech at all and doesn't deserve protection because there isn't a person behind it, someone who's claiming to be a person, who can be held responsible as a person, who's part of it's really a total, I would say, mystification, and camouflage. And I don't think that sort of speech should be, well, I guess not. I'm not saying Rae thinks otherwise. I think we're absolutely on the same line. That sort of speech should not be protected. It shouldn't even be called speech. So I would say, first of all, it's important to distinguish between information that's going out there, and I have no problem with that. If it's like the petrol gauge or the computer. I mean, you could also have information coming in, like information on the stock exchange, the prices of all of that, assuming it's genuine information, it's not anyone really speaking to you, that's absolutely fine. I mean, and that it's available is fine, provided it's reliable, of course. Then there's the speech, which is just an automaton that is the channel. It's really just like a microphone. That's fine too, provided it's clear who's at the back of the microphone and they're answerable for it. So the bot is really a pretense that, this is a person speaking to you. No one answers to what it says. So, I'm all for just protecting human speech at the moment. Now, corporate speech is a big issue. I'm not going to say anything about it just now. It'll probably come up again because I've spoken too long.
Tony, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think for me the worry is that when machines speak, or I should say when we describe machines as speaking, that we make assumptions about the capacities of these machines that they simply don't have. And it's easier for us to say that they're rights holders. But also going back to something we were discussing before, it's easier for us to see them perhaps as even bearers of responsibilities. And this is problematic, that this somehow lets us off the hook because we're ascribing certain capacities to them that they don't have.
Great. I'm sure lots of people have questions. Should we take 2 or 3, starting with Honora? Do we have a mic, or are we just going to just shout?
Okay, yeah. I'll stand up and be loud. I'm, of course, tempted to say many things in response to that, and I agree entirely that echoes are not speech acts, and automated echoes are certainly not speech acts. So that I'd be happy to put away. But I wanted to say something very much more specific about the claim by Google that regulating free speech is censorship. And I think it's absolutely clear, no, it is not. And the reason it is not censorship is that there is a plurality of human rights, and the other rights too need protecting, so that, for example, when we think about regulating speech in order to prevent defamation, in order to prevent breach of copyright, in order to prevent confidence tricksters and fraudsters, that is not censorship. That is the adjustment, the proper adjustment of some human rights to other human rights. And I think that this is such a major onslaught on the very idea of standards that we need to be very clear that it is not censorship to regulate speech. It is only censorship to regulate speech for no sufficient reason.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
So maybe this has already been touched about a little bit, but I'd just like to try and make it explicit. Whether some of the concerns you raised for automated speech generators, whether it would make any difference at all to these arguments if it was instead generated by actual humans, but again, do it in a deliberately manipulative way. So if you have 1,000 professional trolls who coordinate to go into forums and amplify certain opinions that they don't necessarily hold, or anyway, they only express them on those forums in order to create the same effect that you could make with an automated speech generator, maybe instead. So whether it makes any difference that there's actually a human being behind that deluge of comments, or whether the human machine thing's actually what
One more at the back, yeah.
So I have a request, I guess, for clarification about exactly how we should understand this notion of a human behind speech, a person that we can hold to account. I'm wondering in particular about cases like when we discover a very old manuscript, say, which seems like a paradigmatic case of speech, right? It might tell us all sorts of things about life in ancient Greece 2,000 years ago. But it's totally opaque to me that there's any sense in which there is still a human being behind this speech that we can hold to account, who is sort of part of our community of speakers and who is subject to our standards and who we can rebuke in appropriate ways if it turns out everything they said was false. And so I'm just puzzled about cases like this, in which it seems like there's a case which looks like a paradigmatic case of speech, but there is no speaker who we can incorporate into our community, who we can hold to account for what they have said.
What is that example again? I'm sorry, just mentioned the example at the beginning.
Archaeologists come upon a manuscript.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
To me, okay.
I think that's to you.
Okay.
And then we'll come back to you.
I think there's always a problem with, we hold one another responsible. And then we look to say, and in holding someone responsible, you blame them, you feel you could have exhorted them, they should have done this. When you remonstrate with them on what you've done, you sort of stand by the attitude of someone who could have exhorted. You say, you were exhortable, so to speak. No, you could have done otherwise. It's the sort of tone of voice in which you might have said, you can do otherwise, you can tell the truth. When you say you could have told the truth, it's rebuking in the past. So that's interactive. Of course, we then say, well, was Caesar responsible? Do we hold Caesar responsible for the civil war in the Republic in the 40s or whatever, the ancient 40s BC? And obviously we can only do that by extrapolation from the face-to-face example. We don't get angry with Caesar, but we perhaps think that it would be appropriate for people at the time. And so you distance it, but you maintain the same thing. Now, I think when you come across the manuscript, the archaeological finding or whatever, that, of course, most of these just simply about how many flagons of wine, are kept in such and such a place. So that you come across a manuscript that tells you something, it claims about the views that people hold, say, certain values, an ethical manuscript or whatever thing. I think you treat it as if there were a speaker there. You might strongly disagree with it. In disagreeing with it, you might think it was still understandable, intelligible, that they said what they said, and you might explain it away, so to speak, about how they were mistaken in thinking that those, say, of another tribe were not fully human or something like that. But all of that is like extrapolating from our face-to-face experience. So it is parasitic on our doing that in the face-to-face. Now, I want to say in the canonical, as it were, scenario of speech, people speak about things, they tell you about what's happened, what's going to happen, what they believe, whatever. But whenever they speak about anything, they always speak for themselves, in the sense that if they tell you that the population of Wales is smaller than Scotland, to take a random example, what they're communicating and committing to is that they believe that, So if they don't act as if they believe that, and you rebuke them later for having misled you, they can't say, gee, I must have gotten my belief about that wrong. They were speaking about something in the world, Scotland and Wales and the populations, but they were also communicating. They were speaking for themselves, for the beliefs that they held. Now, it's essential to speech, it seems to me, in the canonical situation, that speakers, whatever they speak about, they willy-nilly, they speak for themselves. Now, of course, that becomes very explicit if they're making a promise or whatever. But all speech is sort of on the way to promising. Our words are considered our own. Now, that means, I think when you talk about free speech, which is so important, absolutely, I'm sure we all agree with that here, but it's the protection that it gives for people, rather than the protection that it gives for speech that's important. The speech is important because it's the speech of persons. So that's why I think you always have to hear a voice behind it. And if it can be pretend speech, as in the bot that, the crazy anti-Semitic one, that's not really speech. It's total deception to be presented as if it were speech. Similarly for the bot that, doesn't exactly just relay a message, where the speaker is. They still do it in television in Britain, where they say at the bottom, this message was sponsored by so-and-so. That's very good, but the bots should always have, if they're speaking, this message was sponsored by, identifying the speaker who can be held to account. I don't know.
Do you want to say about the army of trolls?
So I think this is a great question, and one issue is whether there's a normative difference between the army of trolls versus the army of bots, or only one bot, since they can do the work of an army. And I think there is a normative difference in the sense that in one case you've got agents who are misbehaving very badly, and the other you don't in the same way. But what you're raising is the important question of what a principle of free speech actually covers, even for human beings. So if human beings are behaving like an army of bots, are they acting in a way that abides by a principle of free speech? And so going back to Mill, are they acting in a way that is engaged in the pursuit of knowledge? So this is not the only rationale for free speech, but some have argued, whether based on Mill or Kant or or another very good reason, that actually a right to free speech doesn't protect a right to lie. So Shona Shifrin, the legal theorist, has a book arguing that very case. The issue of sincere speech that Philip just raised, some people have argued that a free speech protects sincere, even if completely misguided speech. And the army of trolls that's aiming mainly to get the speech sort of replicated as often as possible for some political end isn't fulfilling those goals. But that would take us to substantive views about the rationale for speech for human beings. But I think it's a great question, yeah.
Yeah, just on the point, Onora's point, going back to the Google example, and legitimate restrictions on free speech. I think that's an important point. And in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that I cited at the start, I actually left out the third paragraph, and it's really important. And the third paragraph is that the exercise of the rights provided for in this article carries with it special duties and responsibilities. It may therefore be subject to certain restrictions, but these shall only be such as are provided by law and are necessary for respect of the rights or reputations of others, and for the protection of national security or of public order or of public health or morals. And I think in the Google example, there was no case to be made for any legitimate restriction. And so those who are arguing on behalf of Google said that this would be censorship if their search results were somehow regulated.
So could I, before we take just a follow-up which relates to this, which is the issue of anonymity, because that's obviously a huge part of this. One of the reasons it's hard to tell the bots apart from the people is no one has to give their real name. So where does anonymous speech, because I think we would probably all agree that there are many circumstances in which there is value to anonymous speech, but do you not want to call it speech if no one owns it?
Well, I think that anonymous information is fine. So information about the stock exchange, information about how the economy is doing, information about the population or whatever it might be, information about all of that's fine, and I don't mind it being anonymous, provided there's somebody responsible for seeing that it is that it's fine. But I think when it comes to something more than that, just information, transmission, like the petrol gauge is the extreme case. I think that yes, I don't like anonymous speech, I must say. I think that it's very important that it can be named and traced. That said, it must be said, so in the perfect world of free speech, first of all, there's a range of speech that is protected, and that won't include, it'll vary from country to country, but in my ideal world, it would include hate speech, for example, whereas others might take a different view on that. You'd have a range of speech, and then it's protected in the sense not just that, as a matter of fact, people aren't hindered when they try to say those things, but they know they're not going to be hindered, and they know they've got that sort of protection. And so and this goes back to a debate Ray and I have had over 20 years, if, for example, in a situation where it's clear they were perfectly free to approve, there wouldn't have been, a problem about their, disapproving of something. If they say nothing, that can be taken as approval. Silence can be enfranchised. It can be made, they can speak for themselves. They don't always, and I think we won't disagree really on this, but there are many circumstances where silence is really valuable. Now, in North Korea, I gather, I suspect, silence is worth absolutely nothing. So when no one criticizes the great leader, that's not to say that they approve necessarily of him, because you criticize at your peril. The whole idea of free speech is that you should. Now, I think that with the anonymity might have a role in a situation where there is not an ideal world of free speech. And so it's, that novel, or is it a film? I can't remember. I think both I've seen, where it's in Hitler's Germany and the person writes these postcards and leaves them in doorways around Berlin, criticizing the regime. All for that, of course, but that's precisely because it's not a world of free speech. That's why the anonymity is actually perfectly defensible there.
But you would disallow anonymous online commenting? There's a lot of it about, and it's a big question for newspapers, among others.
What usually happens at the anonymous online is you get an artificial internet persona, right? That's often the case. And of course, that persona may not be, say, in my case, Philip Pettit, but I may say, I might say David Runciman Pettit. I invent a name that's not going to be traced to you. I think that's probably okay, because that persona is sort of answerable in the world of the internet to his or her opinions. Now, the trouble is that such a persona can be outrageous, and not prove answerable, as in evidence is produced saying this is wrong, blah, blah, blah. It just doesn't respond. It says that's crap or something like that. That is an abuse of the speech situation. And it's true that the online communication makes that very, very, very possible, where it maybe isn't so easy or possible in the face-to-face.
I think I disagree with Philip's distinction between information and speech acts, because I think that even it's not just information that can get past. Information isn't anything unless it's asserted. So there's always a speech act with it. Otherwise, it's not just there is no such thing as information just like that. It's information that the temperature is such and such. It has to be attributed. It has to have an assertoric content. There's always an attributed speaker performing a speech act, and so we can't just talk about this quantity of information. This is something Honora has talked about, actually. We can't just talk about information as if it's this stuff. We need to, when we're talking about freedom of speech, and when we're talking about even unfree speech, we're talking about speech acts, not information. Even when the only reason we want to listen to the speech act is because we want the information. What time does the train go, or whatever. So even in the cases where information, so-called, is being transmitted, it's always information that is supposedly being asserted. So there's an attribute. So if it's being asserted, it's being claimed to be true. If it's being claimed to be true, they ought to be sort of sticking by it. And so there should be a default presumption of ownership. And I agree with Philip about one thing, which is that anonymity is what you need in non-ideal circumstances on particular topics. So anonymity was necessary for gay people to talk to each other via the internet and realize that it wasn't quite so weird to be gay in sort of earlier days of the internet. It's necessary for whistleblowing sometimes. It's necessary for various things. But should it be the routine persona? I think I disagree that the persona is good enough for a speaker. The default should be ownership, but on the other hand, what that means is that we need to build the speech situations to make that default more livable.
I'll make a very small response to that very quick.
Well, then we have got
when you put up a wind thing on the house, to show you the direction of the wind, you get information from that. Somebody's put it up, of course they could have rigged it so it doesn't actually respond to the wind properly. That seems to me, Ray, to be at that end, or the petrol gauge. That's why I mentioned it. Examples where, there isn't really anybody speaking. It's an established, someone's in charge of it, but it's a source of information. And I'm inclined to think, surely there's a spectrum. I agree with you on that. But there's an end over here, like the flagpole, the wind is blowing, or the wind gauge, the sundial, the petrol gauge, the thing on your computer that shows how big how full the battery or empty the battery is. All of those seem to be over towards that end. Now, I agree with you. There's certainly a modulation towards the other end where someone is speaking for themselves. But anyhow, I just wanted to keep my end up.
Exactly. So, John and then Christian and then, John.
I just want to come back to these much derided online comments, because most of the discussion about online comments is in fact essentially anecdote. various kinds. And a few years ago, as you will remember, we did an empirical study because we wanted to explore the extent to which the quality of commenting depends on whether or not people have to own their words. And it just so happens that the Huffington Post did a controlled experiment for us. They didn't realise they were doing it for us, but they did. But on a certain day in December, about 4 years ago, they changed their rules. Before that date, anybody could comment either anonymously or under any name they thought of. And after that day, they had to use their Facebook identity, or at least they had to use a persistent identity. And what we did is we scraped 35,000 articles on either side of the decision.
Date.
And we scraped 42.4 million comments.
Wow.
And then we looked at what happened. Well, what happened, it was quite interesting in lots of ways. For example, the first thing that happened is that the volume of commenting dramatically decreased. That's predictable. Some topics disappeared. For example, all that rude stuff about Michelle Obama disappeared overnight. But the really interesting
You mean the
part-
stuff claiming she was gay or something?
all kinds of rude stuff about her.
Yeah, right, okay, yeah.
But the other thing that's interesting is that some topics endured across the divide. For example, single same-sex marriage, and most of the environmental stuff, which people normally think is very vituperative. So what our conclusion from it was that among other things, owning your words stops what we came to call drive-by commenting, the kind of really callous, stupid stuff. We tried to do, we tried to make assessments about whether or not the quality of the discourse had improved much. That's hard to do with 44 million comments. Did the spelling improve? Well, maybe not. But what was interesting about it is that there was a residue of serious speech, which never gets past the derision of the academic community in general. But there was something serious there, and it's a part of the public sphere that probably is worth having, and most of us think it isn't.
Christian.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on the discussion between Rae and Philip about speech acts. So I think it might be useful to distinguish between speech acts on the one hand, and then information production or information release events or signaling events or something like this on the other hand. Now, every speech act is also a signaling event or an information release or information production event, but not every information production event is a speech act. So the petrol gauge device in the car will release information, so it can causally produce this sort of event, but it doesn't engage in a speech act. Or likewise, the completely non-agential algorithm or bot on the internet, again, releases signals or information, but it doesn't engage in speech acts. So speech acts require the presence of an actual agent who intentionally engages in this act. Now, if one has this distinction, one might say that conceptually, at least, the idea of free speech covers speech acts. And that leaves it open to what extent other regulatory constraints might capture mere information release or signaling events. So those would not be automatically covered by free speech if we are willing to draw this distinction. And I mean, the one motivation for drawing this distinction is precisely that given current technology, there are far more devices, entities, or systems that release information or produce informational output than agents. Not every system that produces informational outputs is an agent, but to engage in speech acts, I guess by definition, one has to be an agent.
Sorry.
We'll just take one more and then we'll, yeah.
So I had two concerns, one with what Philip said and one with what Rae has said. You've sort of dealt with my issue that I have with what Philip has said. But my concern with what both of them are saying is that all of this might work fine because we live in, Philip's prohibition on anonymous speech and Rae's prohibition on amplified mass action through bots might work fine because we live in this nice, comfortable Western democracy. But for some of us who didn't grow up in democracies, we might have concerns that both a prohibition on anonymous speech and a prohibition on bots feed in really well to what a totalitarian regime would want. So one is a prohibition on protecting yourself, where you might be in a dangerous situation, but you still want to engage in political speech. And another one seems to be a prohibition on protest, right? So mass action is really important. You look at bots and you go, yes, bots are doing bad things now, but that doesn't seem to be a feature of what the bots are doing. Bots are just a way to engage, to engage in a lot of speech where it might otherwise be drowned out by more powerful speakers, right? So it's a way that you can level that speech playing field, right? Because speech is, if no one hears you, then, what's the point, right? So my concerns are just there with that, these things are fine in Western democracies, but maybe these prohibitions work less well once we move out of this, let's move out of this situation.
Great. Okay. I'll ask Toni if she wants to say something first before you two get back. No? Okay. Who wants to?
Rae, you were going to go in earlier, so.
So I don't think bots have any rights, so we're not sort of prohibiting them as speakers. But could there be, could any policy backfire? Yes, it could. And so I wasn't getting into the question about what the policy should be on them, except that they certainly, the ones that I was talking about, I firmly believe are undermining the democratic process. So we shouldn't get righteous about bots. I saw on Reddit there's a sort of bots rights section. So there should be no self-righteousness about that topic. But this question that has come up in the background about how you need to be an agent to perform a speech act, to me this is ideal theory of speech acts. So it's a certain ideal that says that and it's a normatively loaded picture of speech acts, which I approve as an ideal, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to count as a speech act if a bot utters it. So I believe, and not just because I read it in The Guardian, I believe that this bot that I was describing was advocating a race war. Now, advocacy of a race war is not sending out some information. It's performing a certain kind of speech act, very like the one that Mill said would not be protected speech. For instance, Mill said that here's a speech act that would not be protected: yelling at, or holding a placard outside the corn dealer's house saying the corn dealers are the starvers of the poor. He said it would be fine to say that in a newspaper, but it's not fine to say it to an angry crowd in front of a corn dealer's house. Why not? Because it's advocacy of a certain violent behavior. And this would be advocacy of a certain violent behavior because it's got the functional profile of it. Philip is very willing to be functionalist about certain things, mental states and things like that. I'm willing to be functionalist about certain sorts of speech acts if they fit. If it quacks like a duck enough, it's a duck for certain purposes. That doesn't mean that it should be. We want to measure the bitter actuality in terms of the ideal and say, yeah, let's get there, but we don't get there by pretending we haven't got something here.
That's a great point, actually. I mean, it's certainly true that it masquerades as a speech act. I mean, there's a supposed speaker behind the words that are uttered. I mean, it doesn't come across as a random, it doesn't present itself as just a random sequence of sounds that happens to make sense, It is presented as a speech act. And, I don't think we need to have a quarrel about whether it's actually a speech act or not, because the important point to agree on is it's not the sort of speech act. Well, even if suppose it were saying, and suppose we're in a democratic society, to take up this last point, and suppose the bot is producing, it's opining about various things. It's not particularly objectionable, but it's opining about this, that, and the other, right? But it's actually some sort of algorithm that's producing these more or less random sort of. It's going to seem like there's a speaker there, but none of us is going to want to be very anxious, I think, about preserving the freedom of that bot, to operate like that, because it's not serving the purpose of free speech, which is to protect persons in order persons to allow them say their bit. And we have here something that's, I agree, it's a speech act. You can treat it certainly as a speech act. There isn't really any necessary division between Rae and me, I think, on that. The question is whether or not it should be protected. And of course, we'll all say it shouldn't be protected if it's the the bot that you talked about, the anti-Semitic one. But suppose it's just opining, but not in a particularly hostile way to any group. I think even that bot should not be protected, because it's masquerading as a person and it's really just generating noise in the system. Now, if I can just very briefly, John's comment, if I heard you right, it does seem to me to suggest that you responsibilize speech, as some people say. You evoke responsibility in the speech that occurs once you've got that sort of anonymity rather than anonymity, right? Even if it's internet anonymity, even if it's not traceable back to a physical persona, it's traceable back to an internet persona. And I find that a very congenial theme, and going back to the voice behind the speech and the importance of protecting a person. Because free speech is important because it enables people to establish themselves where they belong, what they believe, in critical interaction with others, and that interaction should evoke a sort of responsibility. You don't want to be saying stupid things if you're shown to be stupid, or false things, or insincere things if you're shown to be a liar. So there's a natural regulation built into speech itself. And going back to Nora's on that point, it's not censorship if you're regulating proper speakers, stopping them from saying things like hate speech that are beyond the bounds of protected speech. And it's not censorship if it's bots that you're regulating, even if you're prohibiting them. It's only censorship when you're dealing with people who are speaking within the protected range of speech, or this range that ought to be protected in your view. Back to the point about to get clear about, the point about democracies. I think Rae and I were agreed on that anonymity would be fine if you don't have a democracy. It can be a means of emancipation. It was just as you said, the comfortable sort of democracy. I don't know how comfortable it is any longer in many of these democracies, but at least something that's close to an ideal of a democracy. I think anonymity can be more of an enemy, but in that sort of situation, I think we agree that it can be quite positive.
But what about the point that not just anonymity, but noise, almost random noise, is sometimes needed to drown out what's coming the other way? That in a way was the more striking remark.
Well, you see, the Supreme Court defended Citizens United. They did not do it on the basis, they didn't do it on an honest basis, in my view, which is they regard corporations as persons with the right to speak. What they said was, no, the amount of speech, is really a good in itself, just to maximize the amount of speech. But if there's no one can be held responsible, I think that is precisely just licensing the production.
But there might be some circumstances in which the amount is so restricted that volume is a good in itself. But
that's what Rae and I agree with.
Right,
If it's circumstances less than the ideal ones.
It seems that there's an imbalance between who can speak a lot and who can't speak a lot, right? So the bots are a means of equalizing that. Because I'm never going to be able to speak as much as, say, the president of the country. But and people of, say, my political persuasion or my status in society. But through combined effort with bots, we might be able to raise our speech up.
Okay, so we start with Greg at the back, and then we'll,
I guess I have two questions. One, this gets to the Michael John point that was raised. One way of looking at free speech is about the rights of the speakers, but the other is about the rights of the hearers, right? What Michael John is saying is that the democratic public, he's actually not as much concerned with the rights of the communists to present the communist point of view, but the right of the democratic public to hear it and then consider it, right? And I do wonder if it looks different when you look from that angle. I mean, in some sense, I don't know. So Disney designs computers that just make much better movies than any human could. It does seem like maybe you're depriving the public in some, I don't know, I guess there's just a general question of whether it looks different from the hearers as opposed to the speaker's perspective. From the speaker's perspective, I agree, it's obvious bots don't have those rights. But I don't know, maybe we have some rights to hear things that bots might produce, I don't know. But then I guess the second point is just, to what extent is this about just a fear that we're being manipulated? And how much is it actually a fear about AI, right? So it might, it seems like plenty of, Don Draper was manipulating people in Mad Men, and AI just helps people do that. I was reading a story a while back about, how they can just discover really quickly what formula of headline will make you go click on it. Now, isn't that just better Don Draper? I mean, is that something that because it involves mining tons of data and using artificial search and stuff that's somehow different for us? So those are, I don't really know the answers to those. Those are just general questions.
So with the artificial intelligence, surely it's actually quite easy to manipulate AI. If you look at the recent Volkswagen emission scandals, people thought they were petrol gauges giving reliable readings, but in fact they were being manipulated.
Yep.
And it may have been 10 years before we found it, or it was found.
Joanne.
I actually have a couple comments on the previous conversation. So I think I can clarify a couple of things with the gauges and with including the weather gauges. I have argued earlier, and I'll to restate, it's not the gauge that's trying to speak in that case. It is that someone has made the decision to put a gauge on a car, and it is Volkswagen's fault if Volkswagen is lying with their gauge. And if someone puts a weather gauge on their house, they are trying to communicate the direction of the wind, at least to themselves, but there's a knock-on consequence for other people around them. So I think some of the intentionality we can get at if we see these as extensions of ourselves, as we see our devices as extensions of ourselves. About the anonymity, I think part of the reason that we're struggling here is that we all have read and possibly written valuable comments that for good reasons we didn't want to expose our identity, or somebody didn't expose their identity. So it could be whistleblowing, or actually it can be about leveling the playing field. So maybe you're a famous philosopher and you just want to weigh in on Wikipedia, but you don't have a way to say, oh, famous philosopher said this, right? So one of the things with a sufficient portion of text is you can see the quality of the argument and something of the identity. You see a bit of the phylogeny, you see a bit of the education or whatever, and you can assess that, oh, that's a good argument, I recognize a good argument, I can run away and use that good argument. And that seems more valuable, even if it doesn't have a name that's put next to it. The problem with the Twitter bots is that it's 140 characters, and it is very carefully crafted. They figured out exactly what to say. A lot of times, they're not even trying to say, maybe it's an argument they got from a real person, they're just repeating it a million times, but they're only trying to manipulate the statistics on the side so that people will believe this really is a trending topic and that everybody's on their side. So that people, and so I think Twitter gets dangerous because of one of the what was initially a nice thing is the discoverability of other people that think like you, but that wraps around. And just to quickly answer this argument, but like, isn't that great that we can go? I actually have a video of one of the generals that works with Donald Trump talking about how they ran this great insurgency using Cambridge Analytica, which was paying him against the American people. The American military ran an insurgency against the American people, and that's how Trump got elected. And he was happily using that language, and which gets back to that was Mr. money that was doing that. I'm sympathetic with you believing that you can hack up something and compensate for the power the president has, but I would caution you because I think that the people who can do the most repeats are the ones with the most money. So I don't think that's really a viable tool for political action. It's just not, at least not shouting at face.
Okay, great. Okay, lots of things. Thank you.
Yeah, just coming back to the anonymity, I think anonymity when speech is protected still really worries me. and free speech that we can attribute to particular people is important, so that we can hold speakers to account and we can challenge them and we can debate. And I still think that that's fundamental.
Mm. Well, the rights of hearers, Greg, I agree with you. That's a very important perspective on the speech. And of course, that has been invoked by defenders of Citizens United, that, you know, the more speech, the better. It helps the hearers. I would argue it doesn't help the hearers unless you know who's speaking, you know, and who you can rely on, and you know their reputation is at stake. Otherwise, you know, talk is cheap. It's very, very cheap indeed if you don't know who's speaking, you know. You got to make talk costly. And it's costly in the interactive environment of face-to-face, you know, because we have a reputation to protect. We don't want to be silly, we don't want to be proved fraudulent or insincere or whatever. And the trouble with the challenge that we face with the online thing is that we break apart from that discipline, you know. So free speech can become sort of crazy, unlicensed speech, you know. And honestly, when you listen to talk radio, you know, where there is actually anonymity, you know, rather than anonymity, in America, it's just sort of so appalling, you can hardly believe it. But people, can I tell an anecdote? I mean, my partner sat in a plane recently, and she helped this little old lady who was obviously had some problems and walking and so on into a seat, and they sat down, and she seemed very nice, and then she said, just out of the blue, she said, you know, Obama is, of course, a homosexual, and Michel is a man, you know. You can see the bump, she said, you know. And she produced all these, like, completely off-the-planet crazy ideas, right? And when Tori asked her about this and so on, she said, oh, no, I get it I get these, I'm on part of this network, and I get all this information, you know. Now, I mean, that's sort of so crazy, but it sort of just shows you where we can go. I mean, away from responsible speech. Anyhow, I'm talking too much. I think if I can mention the other point that yours, Greg, about nudging. I mean, that's a big issue nowadays, right? So is it awful if you're manipulated? We know that if you're asked, for example, if you're told when you apply for a driving license, look, unless you opt out, you will be assumed to be willing to give your organs in the event of a fatal accident. Only 10% of people opt out. But if you have a system on which you automatically are out, but you have to opt in to be willing to give your organs, only 10% opt in. You know, so it's a massive difference with massive social ramifications. Now, is it okay to nudge people in that way? I actually think it is, provided it's non-deceptive. When is it non-deceptive? Well, in this particular case, by saying you've got to opt out, you're communicating a message. And there is a Speech Act, I agree here, Ray, on the part of the responsible authorities. There's a message that goes, look, this is not so terribly dangerous. The assumption is that people will be happy to, it's not as if you're giving away your soul or risking terrible things to happen. And I think in that case, it's okay. Manipulation is also nudging, but when it's really bad is when it's based on deception. That it's a deceptive message that's communicated, but it's another topic we could have spent a whole session on. Now, on the points that Joanna raised and about the Volkswagen petrol gauge, what I said about that is I think there's always someone who's responsible for that sort of information system, and they should be held responsible for it, but it doesn't make them into speakers. So, for example, you put a weather vane on your house. Maybe it's a seaside town and you're a sailor, a fisherman, but you rig it so that it misleads other people about where the wind is or where to go for the fish or whatever. I mean, that would obviously be very objectionable. And I suppose it's very close to telling a lie in a sense. And similarly with the petrol gauge or the Volkswagen case. So there's standards to which obviously those responsible for an information system, even if we agree it's an information system, that's not a big issue really, I think, should be held. I mean, the standards to which they should be held.
Right.
I'm inclined to think that the focusing on the hearers does make it look a bit different. I mean, do hearers... But I don't think that free speech does depend on a right of hearers. I think it's about the speaker. So I'm sort of not willing. And the role of speech in a democracy is about speakers being able to make choices in a particular domain, especially a political domain, if we're looking at the Michael John argument. And there, I find it hard to extrapolate from the Disney example you mentioned to anything in the political domain that wouldn't just seem completely sinister. But maybe that's a failure of imagination on my part. Whether it's manipulation, I agree with you that everything I've talked about as worrying is manipulative. And in response to an earlier question, I said there's an issue about manipulative speech generally, which that's putting it wrong. It's not just whether it's manipulative, but lying speech, speech that is deliberately drowning other people out. I also mentioned the undermining of trust and credibility, those sorts of things that sort of poison the well of communication. I think it's okay to focus on that because that is the reality that we are facing. So I said before, this is not ideal theory of whether there could be a robot speaker that had a right to free speech or was such that we ought to be listening to them given our rights as hearers, which was the point you were raising. My concern is with the concrete reality that we're facing, where it looks as though the job they're doing is pretty destructive.
I think we have time for one or two more short questions. You have one? Yeah, should we take the last one? Here. Oh.
Just make a statement which I want to discuss. So just thinking from a solution perspective and in reference to bots. So should we have a right to know that it's the bots who are speaking and distinguish that? And what does that solve everything?
Mm-hmm.
Was there what? Sorry, was there one more?
There was one over here. This.
Another. Yeah, have another go.
Yeah, I had another case in mind, which was so I was supposed to set up a bot to train on whatever you say, but you set it up so that it's set up and it says that this is Bruno's opinions, and this represents what he thinks. I mean, it's not him speaking here. Personally, it's a system that sort of mimes his speech and then reproduces fair representations of his opinions. Would that be covered by free speech then? Because in a sense it does speak for me, although it's not me directly producing that speech. I wonder if I should reflect on that sort of case maybe going a bit of the opposite direction.
Okay. Well, on that one, there are two issues that are often run together. One is the free speech issue, what speech should be protected, how it should be protected, and so on. And the other is the opportunity for speech issue. So we know that on free speech, it should be equal for everyone, but the opportunity for speech, of course, can't be equal for everyone. Some have access to television, some have access to, whatever others don't have. And there are other principles that ought to govern, I think, opportunity for speech. Now, with your bot that mimics what I think, and I can send out a dozen of these all over the polity, for example, if I'm a politician, it's like getting the opportunity. I'm on the evening news every evening. I get a half-hour political broadcast every evening because I send out these bots. So I think that would need to be covered by the principles, whatever they are, big issue, governing opportunity for speech rather than the freedom of speech. On the bots, Ray, I'll leave that to you.
Well, if I could comment on that as well.
Sure.
I mean, I do think it raises issues about drowning out other speakers,
Yes.
and I suppose I do think that drowning out speakers prevents them from speaking. So I don't think I have this religious distinction between being free to speak in a kind of negative liberty-ish way. I know you didn't mean it like that because you've got something much more substantial in mind, but you haven't got free speech if you haven't got some basic opportunities to speak, in my view. And this is the idea that free speech is a resource. It involves, you could think it involves a capability. I think people who drum the table for free speech and don't think about literacy. If someone can't read or write, do they have free speech? I think it's their speech itself is limited by that. But would it fix everything? I've forgotten whose question this was. Yes, sorry. Would it fix everything? if certain signs were attached to the bot speech. If only. I mean, it might make it a bit better, and maybe it would, correct for the manipulation issue that was raised earlier. If you know this is a bot, and I am being told honestly that this is a bot, would it fix things up? No, because you'd still have the drowning out issue. You'd still have the marketplace of ideas being swamped by someone who shouldn't be speaking with such a huge megaphone, if it is reflecting an actual human speaker behind the whole thing, as you were imagining. So I don't think it would fix it. And one other proof of that is that advertising works, even though we know it's designed to line the profits of the company, line the pockets of the companies. We still believe it.
I think the rights of hearers, is really useful, and I think that's important. And somebody just brought up a point on that. And I want to go back to the passage that I cited earlier, and that includes a right to receive and impart information and ideas of all kinds. So that right to receive is actually there. But what do we have a right to hear? And I would want to add that we have a right not to be deceived and manipulated, and we have a right to know who we can respond to as well.
That's a very good note on which to end. Thank you very much to all our speakers.